Well, thanks very much for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be here today to give you a bit of background on what's happening for agriculture and trade negotiations. As was mentioned, there's just one or two things going on in that world, and it's really a pleasure to be here and help talk a little bit about Nafta. I want to cover a little bit about the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well as what's happening with our China negotiations. But before I start, I want to address what you see on the screen here as CAFTA, the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance, and also my work at the Canola Council. So as was mentioned, I do work on and lead our market access efforts at the Canola Council, but all export agriculture works together through an organization called CAFTA, the Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance. So the Canola Council is part of that, Cereals Canada, Pulse Canada, Barley Council of Canada, as well as the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, the National Cattle Feeders Association, and others as well. And so I thought it might be best if I could speak with my CAFTA hat on as president of CAFTA to give you a sense of what it means for agriculture more broadly. Of course, you as growers are growing a number of different crops. Your crops are getting fed to livestock, and so I wanted to give you the broadest perspective possible. So throughout the next 25 minutes or so, wanted to give you a perspective on what that means for NAFTA and what it means for Western Canadian agriculture. So sitting here in this room, it may seem like trade is something pretty obvious that helps us. We export 90% of the canola we grow, 90% of the pulses we grow, 2/3 of our pork, more than half of our beef, and actually more than half of everything we produce in Canadian agriculture. So in agriculture, trade means a lot to us, and it seems like everybody should think that we should trade more. But of course, if you're paying attention to the news, as was just referenced, not everybody shares that same perspective. And so we're in interesting times. I wanted to share with you at the outset some of the things that we're seeing on the trade front as we look in different markets. So you'll see on the picture here a bit of a protest that I took a picture of when the Trans-Pacific Partnership was signed in New Zealand about 2 years ago. And there's a lot of people who don't think trade is helping them or not helping their jobs and their economy. And so it's really created a lot of challenge for us, for especially a sector like agriculture in Canada, who really prospers by being able to export what we grow. I love the sign on the right. It's always informative that we should just be down with this sort of thing. But it's not just that. Obviously, south of the border, as was mentioned at the outset, we've got a person in the White House who's been pretty negative towards trade, and actually a lot of people in the United States who don't see that trade's helping them. So people have seen that this globalization has totally wiped out the middle class. There's this perception that it's done by wealthy people to take advantage of us. But in reality, of course, as farmers and growers, you understand that trade benefits people too, but it's not always understood that way, and certainly right now. At the same time, we're seeing that there are trade issues coming up, whether it's canola in China, whether it's GM food in the European Union, or whether it's opposition to the Canada-Europe trade agreement, another protest against that one, or pea imports. You've seen the press on that the last little bit. And even when it comes to broad agreements like the World Trade Organization, where there's a meeting of ministers next week in Argentina. Every 2 years, ministers get together, and so not only are we not getting another WTO agreement, but they can't agree on anything when they come together next week. So we're facing a really interesting time in trade, and for us in agriculture, it's an interesting time indeed, because we want to be able to have better access to markets so we can sell more products and get more value to help you and your operations and everybody in the community that lives off of agriculture in Canada that exports. So a small challenge as we enter these NAFTA renegotiations. We have opportunity for the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership and potentially for a free trade agreement with China. So I wanted to give you a bit of an update around what's happening with those agreements and what it means for agriculture. So let's start off with NAFTA. Sometimes we have to zoom out a little bit to understand where we are, and and how good things have been since Nafta came into effect. In North America now, we're a market of 400 million people, not 30 million in Canada, but 400 million across the continent. So it means that businesses in any of our country can sell virtually without barrier to 400 million people, not 30 million people. And it started, of course, with the Canada-US trade agreement in 1988, and then Nafta came into force in '94. So it's been about almost 25 years. And in that time, our GDP's doubled, and our supply chains, whether it's the beef industry that's really prevalent here, you think about the food processing industry broadly, our supply chains are really integrated. Of course, in Ontario and Quebec, the automotive supply chains are incredibly integrated, but it's just the same in agri-food as well. So the next slide, I wanted to make sure that we understand that trade's actually going in all directions. So while we think about in export agriculture, we always want to export more. The reality is that we as Canadians and people living around Lethbridge here, there's some things we do really well, and then there's some things that make sense to import. And what this chart shows is that trade's actually pretty balanced across all countries in North America. But you may not have thought that. How many people have heard about this whole concept of trade deficits that President Trump's been talking about? Anybody heard about that? Few people? Yeah. So Trump got elected around the idea that people were taking advantage of the US, or certainly some people voted for him around that, because of this idea that we need to export more. But what this shows here is that actually trade's pretty balanced already between the economies, and certainly between Canada and the US. So speaking more specifically about agriculture, how has Nafta worked for agriculture? Well, we've seen that it's been an incredible success for agri-food broadly, and we've heard that come out in the debate around Nafta. So for example, agri-food trade has grown a lot and is really quite balanced. So in Canada, since Nafta came into effect over the last 2 decades, we've grown our agri-food exports by 5 times. 5 times more exports now than 20 years ago. And at the same time, we've actually increased our imports from the United States by 6 times. And actually what's happening is that our agri-food trade balance between the US and Canada is actually quite balanced. So exports have increased a lot, and so have imports. We've also seen that we have highly coordinated supply chains. So going back to what I was saying earlier, we're a market of 400 million people, not 30 million people. And that also means that our businesses and our industries, whether it's in agriculture or in other places, have organized themselves in the best way possible so that we can compete in the world much better than we could before. So I'll give you a couple examples of this. I think it's most prevalent in the meat industry, so whether it's pork or beef. Agriculture Canada likes to use this example of a hamburger. And they take a hamburger and they look at all the different ingredients of it. And they say, how many times does that beef cross back and forth during the lifespan and the production of that product? So whether it's cow-calf feeders going to a feedlot from Canada to the United States, or that animal being fed here in Canada, being processed here, and then the meat being shipped to the US and maybe being shipped back as further processed meat, or maybe it's the live animals from feedlots around here that are going to processing plants in the US to be processed and then may come back in certain cuts. So we're really integrated as an economy. And what it means in the world is that we're exporting that beef to other places. And so compared to a country like Australia, for example, we're able to move things back and forth in the continent and do things in a really efficient way, in the way that other countries can't, per se. So we're really integrated, and that makes us more competitive in the world. And you'd find the same example in the pork industry as well if you're sitting in Manitoba or Iowa or Ontario or Quebec. So we've seen that NAFTA has been a success for agriculture, and a lot of that's because it's allowed us to do what we do best and allowed us to be more competitive in the world. And it's something you're hearing from agriculture right across the continent. So American agriculture has been very vocal with the US administration about how NAFTA's worked well for them. You've heard how the Mexican agricultural industry has also expressed it's working well for them, and certainly for the Canadian agriculture industry, it's working well for us too. So where does that put us now that we're into NAFTA 2.0? Well, first things first is that we want to keep what's working well. So as CAFTA, all of the export agricultural interests, so beef, pork, pulses, cereals, oilseeds like soy, soybeans, and canola, as well as barley, all have the common objective that we don't want to have any harm done to the current conditions of trade. So the do no harm message is the first and foremost one that we're hearing across Canada, and we're also hearing across the United States. Second priority is to modernize the agreement where possible. So I mentioned that NAFTA is almost 25 years old, almost the silver anniversary, and there are certainly opportunities to make it better. So we think about just some examples. Where were we in 1992, right before NAFTA came into effect? What did your cell phone look like? What did your computer look like? Well, you probably didn't have a cell phone, and there were only a few computers, and they didn't have the internet. So the world's changed and the economy's changed, and so the rules that we trade under also need to change. So there are a lot of things in NAFTA that can be upgraded around things like e-commerce. Or I'll give you another example that's really relevant right here in Lethbridge. So there's a Richardson oilseed facility that crushes canola here, and it turns that oil into further processed products like margarine and shortening. And when you made margarine and shortening in the early 90s, you didn't need to use palm oil. But now, if you want to make margarine and shortening, you need to have some palm oil in that. But when you do that, now you can't export that margarine or shortening to the US without having a tariff applied to it. So it's just, there's a number of things that have changed in the world since the early 90s, and that means that there's an opportunity to modernize the agreement where possible. Other things like modernizing the inspection system for meat is another really relevant one for this area. So you think about the beef that we export to the US, it has to get inspected a second time by US inspectors when it crosses the border, even though it's already been inspected at the plant where it's been produced. So the priorities of agriculture in NAFTA are really these two things: do no harm, and secondly, trying to modernize where possible. But there's a bit of a problem with this, and that's what's a new US approach that we've all heard a lot about from the president's tweets. It's America first, and sometimes that can look like the United States is an island, a bit like this picture. And we know that that isn't really the case, but we're working with a president and an administration that has a certain view on things. And that means that the United States Trade Representative, the person in charge of trade for the United States, says to Canada that we should expect new approaches. And what that really means is an approach where it's America first, and that means that any outcome is going to make America do better, and regardless of whether that means things that Canada and Mexico do worse. And that's really quite a change in trade negotiations. Generally, what's happened is you try to find outcomes that make everybody better. And yes, there are compromises that are required, but people make compromises understanding that the outcome will be better than what they started with. Well, with America first and new approaches, that makes that a bit difficult. And the last one I wanted to touch on is a preference for bilateral negotiations and not multilateral approaches. So what that means is the U.S. wanting to have an agreement with just one country rather than having an agreement that touches a lot of countries. So when you think about Canada, that's generally not worked well for us. We're a medium-sized economy, and we do best when we have rules that work for everybody, not rules that are slanted in favor of one large country or one island, if you will. So these new U.S. approaches have created a little bit of friction, and you may have heard about that. So where are we now? I'm sure all of you have seen in the news, there's been lots of talk about Trump tearing up Nafta and lots of talk about what will happen. So I wanted to provide you a bit of a perspective about what we know as agriculture having been really close to the negotiations. So this picture really lays it out, I think. We've got two paths or two tracks going on right now. On the left side, you've got a path that's going pretty well. And this is a path that's focused on modernizing Nafta after 20 years, trying to make it better, trying to make it work better for people and the concerns that they have about the trade agreement, trying to make trade work better on things like margarine and shortening, on beef exports by getting rid of re-inspections. And I would say that path generally is going pretty well. When it comes to the other path, on the right-hand side, that side's not going so well. This is a path where it's the approaches that come from the U.S. first viewpoint, and it's a number of, let's say, exotic proposals in this area that have made it very difficult for Canada and for agriculture too, when we think about the impact of those proposals. So these are proposals where our chief negotiator and ministers have said they're just not able to talk about because they're essentially ridiculous. These are proposals like getting rid of the dispute settlement mechanism between Canada and the US, and we've used that in agriculture and things like pork before. It's things like changing the requirement for auto parts and cars and how much needs to be coming from North America and the United States. It's things like what's been called a sunset clause, where that means that unless everybody agrees that Nafta should continue, it automatically terminates after 5 years. And it's things like the US proposal to want complete access for all products into Canada, like supply management, without providing anything in return to Canada. So for example, we can export a very, very small amount of sugar to the United States. But the US proposal is to say, Canada, get rid of all of your barriers and we're not giving you anything in return. So that's why the path on the right doesn't quite look as good as the path on the left, where on the modernization side, things can go and we can see where that will lead. But when it comes to the exotic proposals, it's a bit more difficult. So the question that you're probably all asking is, well, where do these paths lead and do they ever come back together? And where could we end up? Well, I don't quite have the Wizard of Oz at the end of the path, but what I do want to lay out are some of the things that we're seeing being very close to the negotiations. So we could see a successful modernization. We could see that negotiations will be halted until after the Mexican elections. So Early in 2018, Mexico will enter presidential elections, and that will make it very difficult for their negotiators to continue. So that could be a path where things get halted for a while until the Mexican election is settled. We could see a withdrawal issued by the US, but we could see that the Congress would push back against President Trump, and that withdrawal would not take effect. Or we could see that the US actually withdraws from Nafta. And I would say that all of these are possibilities. What would that mean for, well, firstly, there's been a lot of questions about whether President Trump can actually withdraw from Nafta. And I'm not going to get into a legal analysis of what's possible or not, but I would just say that both the President and Congress both have a role in this, and there's been a lot of discussion about what power the President actually has. What we do know is the President can say he wants to withdraw the US from the agreement, and that can happen 6 months after that. So the President could say tomorrow that he wants to withdraw the US from Nafta, and then Nafta could be terminated as soon as 6 months after that. It's also unclear whether this is actually a tactic that the author of The Art of the Deal wants to use, or whether he actually intends on following through. But I think most people close to the negotiations, including ourselves, would say that this is a real possibility. And what would happen, and what did that mean for agriculture if the US were to withdraw from Nafta? Well, there's been some studies that have looked at what that might do. It would say that for Canada, our exports could decline about $20 billion. But most importantly, for those in the audience here and in places like Lethbridge, where you've got a lot of food processing, that beverages and food products can be some of the most affected and vulnerable industries. So to give you some examples, things like canola oil that are produced here in Lethbridge at the Richardson facility, that would face a tariff of 6.4%, which is quite a large tariff for a commodity like canola, especially when you've got processing facilities south of the border as well that wouldn't have that extra tax put on. So most of our canola oil goes to the United States, and you put a 6.5% tax, that makes it really difficult for facilities here. For beef, right now we've got tariff-free access and quota-free access for both live animals and meat. Taking away the Nafta privilege that we have would mean we'd go to a quota and tariff system. So those are just two examples of how it would affect agriculture, but as I say, beverages and food products and agriculture are some of the most affected by moving from a situation in Nafta where we have privileged access to the US to what the US offers to the rest of the world through its WTO commitment. But all is not lost. We are continuing to engage on behalf of agriculture with negotiators in Nafta. We understand that agriculture is touched by a lot of different aspects of the agreement. So I talked about today tariffs and quotas. I talked about things like rules and plant and animal health inspections. Those are things that fall into the sanitary and phytosanitary chapter, or SPS. But it touches a lot of different aspects of the agreement. And so what happens with the renegotiations is really important for agriculture, not just on the agriculture side with tariffs, but on the rules side across a number of different things. And we as CAFTA, again representing all of the major export interests in agriculture, have been really engaged in the discussions. We meet regularly with the negotiators from Canada. We meet regularly with agriculture and other stakeholders from Mexico and the United States. And we meet often with the political leadership in Canada as well as in the United States and Mexico. So for example, just last week, we were meeting with John Barlow, a local MP here, the Agriculture Shadow Minister from the Foothills riding. And as CAFTA, we've also met with delegations of US congressmen and women. So for example, a delegation of the House of Representatives Agriculture Committee, we met with 5 congressmen there who are really interested in trying to ensure, again, that through these negotiations we don't do any harm. So despite the rhetoric, there's a lot of commonality in agriculture between Canada, the US, and Mexico. And as CAFTA and all the members of CAFTA, we've been really engaged in ensuring that our governments understand that. So just briefly, I wanted to shift and talk for a couple minutes around the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the potential for free trade negotiations with China before I open it up for questions. I hope there's a few questions generated. Because what happens if things don't go great with Nafta, having access to other parts of the world and having privileged access to export our products without trade barriers becomes a whole lot more important. And we've heard this voiced from a number of perspectives, including ourselves, but even last week the trade minister said there's never been a better time to diversify. And I think if we look at the uncertainty in the White House, that we'd all agree with that. Well, what are those options then? What are the options that we have to get better access to other places in the world? Well, one of the big ones is the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I got a bit of a question for you here. How many people saw this picture? Show of hands? A few people. So perhaps others will recognize the story more than the picture, but this was in Vietnam, and this is a picture of all the leaders of the TPP 11 minus the leaders of Canada and Japan. So we've seen in the last 2 weeks that this Trans-Pacific Partnership that started off as a group of 12 countries, but then the United States pulled out in early this year, has now actually moved forward recently in Vietnam. So while a few weeks and months ago, most people thought the TPP was dead because the US walked away, in fact, what happened around this meeting, but not actually at this meeting, was that the other 11 countries, including Canada, agreed on a set of core principles to move forward with this Trans-Pacific Partnership, now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So 11 countries, and most importantly, it includes Japan, which is a huge market for our agri-food products. And this represents a real opportunity for agriculture. What's at stake to get this agreement or not get this agreement? If we got this agreement for canola, we'd see $780 million more in exports by getting rid of tariffs in places like Vietnam and Japan especially. For wheat and barley, we'd see better access to Japan. For beef in Japan, we'd see the tariffs that we currently face at 50% go to 27%. And for pork, we export about $1 billion roughly to Japan. And currently, what's happening in the world is Japan is getting agreements with other countries like Australia and like the European Union. So the world's moving forward, and if we don't have this agreement to help keep up with those, we're actually going to fall back. So there's no status quo when it comes to Japan. So the opportunity with now this recent agreement on core elements of the TPP in Vietnam is really good for agriculture and really good for Canada. So we're not quite there yet, but this could be something where we could get it across the line in the next number of weeks and more likely months. Next, I wanted to touch on China just a little bit. As was mentioned, the Prime Minister's been in China, is in China right now actually, and has been talking about a free trade agreement. We haven't heard any announcement yet, but we understand that the Trade Minister is still in Beijing. And for agriculture, I think I wanted to highlight just how huge an opportunity this is. When we think about China, it's soon to be the world's largest economy. It will be the world's largest importer of agri-food products by 2020. And yet we still face a lot of barriers on the products that we send there. And so having a free trade agreement like Australia already does with China, like New Zealand already does with China, like Chile already does with China, could help us have better access for the things that we grow and the things that we produce here in Canada. So a few examples of that. For our canola, getting rid of the tariffs in China could help us export another $1.2 billion of canola. It could be better access for malt barley. So right now, because of the agreement that Australia has with China, they don't have any tariffs on their malt barley. They have an advantage over us. And so having an agreement to get rid of the tariffs on Canadian malt barley into Japan, or China rather, would help us. Think about wheat. Right now, I think the quota that China has for wheat is only filled about 9%. 9%, so there's opportunities for us to expand the amount of wheat that we export with better access to China. And of course, with beef and pork, having better terms of trade for those commodities would help all the things we grow here in Canada that are fed to our livestock, and of course the farmers who are raising beef and pork as well. So huge opportunity in China if we're able to get rid of trade barriers through a trade agreement. So that wraps up what I wanted to share. I hope there's a few questions. Again, my name is Brian Innes. I work with the Canola Council, but I'm also president of Afta, and so glad to share a perspective on what we're doing on your behalf to help get better access to international markets and think about what's after Nafta.
Oh, there's got to be some questions on this one. Who wants to jump to the mic first? Okay, if you hesitate, I'll jump in. If you were a betting man, not that I'm saying you're a betting man, but if you were a betting man, what would you put as the odds for Nafta succeeding?
Well, I would say that they're not very good at the moment. What we see is that there's opportunity to come to an agreement, but the road on the right, as I described, isn't going in a good direction right now. And so the odds of NAFTA succeeding from our perspective, or the renegotiation succeeding in the short term, are not good. But what we do understand is that the negotiations extending into the first quarter of 2018 as being very helpful. It gives negotiators more time, it gives our governments more time to think about options to move forward. And it also gives stakeholders in the United States an opportunity to talk to their congressmen and women and help get a policy that will enable growth going forward.
All right, Senator Stanford.
Yeah, you knew I'd ask a question. Hey, Brian, like Japan, they're really in favor of TPP, and a lot of the other Asian countries are too. So does our federal government have enough will or enough, do they want to have this free trade deal go through with TPP?
Well, that's a good question, Gary. What I'd say is that 6 weeks ago, everybody thought the TPP was dead. And we came out of Vietnam with an agreement on core principles, with a few minor things around the edges where there's still more negotiations to work out. So I can't speak on behalf of the government, but what I can say is that our government did sign on to that core agreement and core principles. And what I can say is that we're continuing to advocate on behalf of agriculture to ensure that our government understands the value of the TPP 11 for agriculture. And we've had very receptive ears for that discussion. So I would say that there's significant understanding about the value of the TPP for agriculture. We've seen our government be at the table despite the picture. As I say, the picture was one thing, but what came out of that week was an agreement, and that was something that no one thought was even possible a few months ago. And we'll continue to make sure that everyone understands the importance of that agreement for moving agriculture forward and preventing us from sliding backwards.
And what about China? You know, we think dealing with the U.S. has its challenges, but we've seen in the past China as a trading partner can find some phytosanitary trade barriers that can pop up rather quickly. You know, do we want to have a deal with them, or are they good people to be in partnership? Have some of these other countries, when they've signed a deal, does China play by the rules in a deal or still find ways around them? Because they're very skilled negotiators, are they not?
They are very skilled negotiators, and I think that I'll share just one quick story. We, with the Canola Council, do a lot with China. It's one of our largest markets. About a third of our canola goes to China. And obviously we've had some disagreements, shall we say, but we still export a third of our canola to China. And they still see huge opportunity for growth in that market. And they import more than half of all the world's oilseeds. So the question for us is not whether we want to be a partner with China or not, but recognizing that China buys more than half of all of the oilseeds traded in the world. And they're the largest economy. So it's a question of how good do we want our relationship to be? And I always see it as it's a question of trying to move things forward. So China's been looking to engage with Canada with free trade negotiations for a number of years. 5 years ago, we had a study that looked at the benefit of a free trade agreement between Canada and China by both of our governments. So China's been asking Canada to go forward for a long time. It's a bit like if someone's looking to take your relationship to the next level and wants to propose to you. After a while, they're going to stop asking. And so when I think about our opportunity to have better trade with China, what we've seen work for the Aussies and the New Zealanders is more engagement helps. We need to be closer to China to help resolve some of these differences. It's true that they function a little bit differently than we do, but I think if we look south of the border, they haven't always been a great trading partner either, whether it's softwood lumber or other issues that have come up. So when we look where things are going for agri-food and the things that everybody in this room produces, that's where the demand is and where it will grow. And so the question is, how do we make that better? And we see and have seen with others that more engagement helps, and a free trade agreement is a way to help move that forward.
All right, John, you've got a question? Go ahead.
Yeah. That marriage analogy was great, because that's kind of brings me to my point is, at this point in time, we still think we're married to the Americans under the Nafta agreement. If we start dating the Chinese and the Japanese and the rest of the TPP participants, does that not weaken our position with NAFTA?
Well, I want to be a little bit careful on the marriage analogy with this one. Perhaps I can only take it so far. I didn't say it was a marriage, by the way. I said it was a relationship. There's lots of different relationships we could have. So I think it strengthens our position. And certainly that's what we've heard from our federal government, talking about the importance of diversifying our trade opportunities. And we see that as important because it helps to have options when things don't go well. It helps to have an option to take advantage of growth that may happen in one place and not another. So we see having more diversity as a good thing. There's never going to be anything that displaces the importance of the US market for Canada. I think we all recognize that we're friends, we're neighbors, we're allies, and despite some of the current chaos, we share a whole lot more in common with the US than we do with anybody else in the world. So I'm not suggesting that that will change. What I'm suggesting is that we see a lot of growth opportunity in other places, and we should be seizing that growth opportunity, and now is the perfect time to do that. I hope that answers your question. I don't think it weakens our position with the Americans. The Americans have lots of other trading relationships as well, every country is out to get the best for the people that live there and the businesses that operate in their country.
Is it a bit, you know, just in watching trade talks over the years in the WTO and all this, and even Vietnam with the empty chairs, even though these are high-level diplomatic talks, is it a bit like, I'm looking for a sense of the atmosphere. Is it a bit like a poker game or horse trading? I mean, sometimes you have to play strong and sometimes you have to step back. Is it kind of a very interesting people reading dramatic dance, even though we're talking about millions of dollars of trade at stake? Is there some of that very delicate and yet needing to be strong positioning that has to happen? Is it, you know, a little bit of drama at play?
Absolutely. So we see this up front and close as part of CAFTA. So CAFTA was at every round of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Canada was part of. We've been at every round of the NAFTA negotiations, and so we see that play out very close and very personal. We saw it play out in the TPP in the Hawaii round before things concluded in Atlanta. We've seen it play out in Vietnam, and we've seen it play out even just in Beijing this week, where literally the minister's staff or the trade minister were on the plane ready to leave, and they got pulled back in to continue talks in Beijing. So yes, there's a lot of drama that goes into these things. Sometimes we have to have a longer vision. That's one of the reasons why we're present, though, is to make sure we see what's happening and we seize those opportunities and help our negotiators get best result. But sometimes it's a bit rocky during the process.
All right. Well, with that, we will wrap up things here. And I just want to thank you, Brian, and thank you, you know, to make sure that agriculture is there. I think you're right. It's very critical that we are at the table. And so thank you for what you do at the head of CAFTA and representing all of our interests as you head to these places and make sure that the ag voice is heard. So thank you again for joining us here today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That was really